Good morning. My name is David Cohen. I always have slides, but today I decided I wouldn't because I thought this is a press conference. It has to be different. So there are no slides. So we'll have to look at each other in the eyes. The larger context for the release of the FDA of its analysis on the relationship between antidepressant drugs and suicide or suicide-related behavior or suicidality, however you'd like to call it, is a crisis of confidence in all industry-sponsored research. And as an example, last year, Richard Smith, who's the former editor of the British Medical Journal, proposed that medical journals should stop publishing all clinical trials. They should only critically evaluate them. He made this proposal because he believed that the medical journals have become an arm of the marketing departments of the drug companies, which is the title of an article he wrote, Medical Journals, arm of the marketing department of the drug companies, and he suggested they should just stop publishing trials. So this is part of the context. And as we focus on this report that the FDA has put out today, then we should emphasize the quality and the validity of the trials in which both David Healy and Joseph Glenmullen have spoken to a bit. And I'd like to repeat some of the information from another angle too. I'd like to emphasize again, how valid are these trials to generate the information that we want to use, to generate the information to even talk about suicides, to talk about this relationship between taking a drug and maybe feeling suicidal or acting on it. And so the simple fact is the trials can only tell us one thing. They can tell us basically that the sponsors of the drugs, of the trials, very, very, very badly want to market the drugs, and that the FDA collaborates with them to do this, in a way, aids and abets them. Most clinical trials that are conducted presently for drug approval purposes or for the purposes of increasing market share of a drug, once the drug is on the market to create positive attitudes among physicians and so forth, have a single purpose, which is to show superiority of that drug over placebo, or equivalence of that drug over an existing drug for treating a certain condition. If you're trying to ascertain the full consequences, the full effects that drug will have on a person over the short and long term, that purpose vastly exceeds the minuscule purpose of a randomized controlled trial as the FDA gives us. In other words, again, I'll repeat this, to ascertain, to determine what is the drug going to do to a person who takes that drug in the short and long term. That is a very, very complex endeavor, which overwhelms the minuscule, extremely narrow purpose of a clinical trial submitted to the FDA, which is simply showing superiority to placebo. So I'd like to emphasize again this morning 2 points I'd like to discuss briefly. One is first of all, because of this background noise, which is that the drugs are efficacious. And the fact, so I'd like to discuss this and suggest that in fact this is not so. This is not the case. They're not so efficacious. On the contrary, what clinical trials manage to show, as the slides that we've seen, especially from Dr. Healy's presentation, is that the placebo response is extremely powerful. Second, I want to suggest that if the FDA wants to approve efficacious drugs, it had better begin to request and obtain some completely different kinds of studies from the sponsors of the drugs. And I'll suggest the kinds of studies that we need to emphasize more, which are in fact the phase 1 studies, the initial studies done on normal volunteers, normal meaning non-psychiatrically diagnosed volunteers. And these studies, in essence, what the FDA should do is to emphasize that when a study is to be done on a psychiatric drug, the study should begin to take as a starting point that psychotropic drugs, psychoactive drugs, have very complex and variable effects. That should be the starting point, the sort of the baseline assumption, and the study should be designed to detect what possible unpredictable effects could emerge from period of time when you give a person a drug with very complex, unpredictable variable effects. That should be the starting assumption for a study that we should be focusing on, rather than these completely concocted, made-up studies with the simple purpose of showing superiority to placebo. So, if a drug is clearly efficacious, it should show its efficacy in extremely small trials. You don't need a large trial to show that a drug is efficacious. And that efficacy should be routinely replicated even in very small trials. But the antidepressants don't show anywhere near this level of efficacy, as we've seen. And as the report says on page 31, and I cite, this was a slide that we saw, the report from the FDA that was released a few days ago, Dr. Mark Stone and Lisa Jones, we read approximately 50% of subjects who received active drug and 40% of subjects who received placebo were designated as responders. So this again, that 50% of people on the active drugs are designated as responders by some specific criteria that the clinicians and the researchers decide, and 40% of people on placebo are also rated as responders. Now, in essence, the entire scientific case for the efficacy of antidepressants rests on this difference: 5 people responding on the drug versus 4 people responding on placebo. That's what the whole that $25 billion industry rests upon, this simple difference. That's what we should be talking about. In other words, that's why these drugs are being marketed, because 5 people respond to them versus 4 people responding to flour or sugar. That's the whole case for antidepressants. Now, that's what it's about. So I'd like to just talk about that a little bit.